At Arrow 9:30 hours on May 25, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel David Niven walked into a military hospital outside London carrying a photograph. Niven was not there as an actor, though before the war he had been one of Hollywood's most recognizable leading men. He was there as an intelligence officer working for the Deception Unit, planning Operation Copperhead. The photograph showed General Bernard Montgomery, commander of 21st Army Group, the force designated to lead the Allied invasion of France. Niven showed the photograph to every patient in the hospital's amputee ward. He was looking for someone who resembled Montgomery closely enough to serve as a body double. The plan was desperate and strange. Montgomery needed to be in two places at once. He needed to be in England supervising final D-Day preparations, and he needed to be seen in the Mediterranean, convincing German intelligence that Allied invasion planning focused on southern France or the Balkans rather than Normandy. The solution was to send someone who looked like Montgomery to Gibraltar and North Africa while the real Montgomery remained in England. But finding a convincing double was nearly impossible. Montgomery had distinctive features: thin face, sharp nose, penetrating eyes, precise mustache. More importantly, he had distinctive mannerisms: arrogant bearing, clipped speech, particular way of saluting, specific gestures when speaking. Anyone attempting to impersonate Montgomery would have to master not just physical appearance but personality. Niven found nothing at the hospital. He moved to the next location on his list, a military pay office where soldiers process paperwork. He showed the photograph to clerks and accountants. Nothing. He visited training facilities, supply depots, administrative offices. Everywhere he went, he showed Montgomery's photograph and asked if anyone looked like the general. On May 25th, after 2 days of searching, Niven was directed to the Army Film and Photographic Unit. Someone there supposedly resembled Montgomery. Niven arrived skeptical. He had seen dozens of supposed resemblances. None had been close enough. He was introduced to Lieutenant M.E. Clifton James, a 47-year-old Pay Corps officer assigned to film unit duties. James was Australian-born, former stage actor, enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force in World War I, wounded at Gallipoli, discharged, moved to Britain, worked in theater and minor film roles through the 1920s and 1930s. When World War II began, he enlisted again, despite being over age. The Army assigned him to Pay Corps administrative work for aging soldiers unsuitable for combat. Niven looked at James carefully. The resemblance was extraordinary. Same thin face, same sharp features, same build. James was slightly older than Montgomery, 47 versus 56, but makeup could age him. The more Niven studied James, the more convinced he became. This was the closest match he would find. There was one obvious problem. James was missing his right middle finger, lost at Gallipoli in 1915. Montgomery had all his fingers. Anyone looking closely would notice the difference. Niven made a note: prosthetic finger required. There was another problem Niven discovered within minutes of conversation. James was an alcoholic, not a heavy drinker, an alcoholic. He drank constantly when alcohol was available. His hands shook in the morning until he had his first drink. His speech became slurred by afternoon. By evening, he was often incoherent. The Army kept him in the Pay Corps partly because his drinking made him unsuitable for anything requiring sobriety. Niven reported his findings to Colonel Dudley Clark, the intelligence officer running the deception operation. Clark reviewed the situation. James resembled Montgomery more closely than anyone else they could find. The physical similarity was remarkable, but James was an alcoholic who would be expected to impersonate Britain's most disciplined, abstemious general. Montgomery was famously opposed to drinking. He did not permit alcohol in his headquarters. He dismissed officers for drunkenness. If James appeared in public drunk, the impersonation would be exposed immediately. Clark made the decision. James would be recruited. They would keep him sober by force if necessary. The operation was too important to abandon because of James's drinking problem. If James refused to cooperate, he would be given no choice. The mission was classified above top secret. James could be detained under military security regulations and compelled to participate. On May 26th, James was summoned to a briefing room and told to sit. 2 intelligence officers entered. They explained that he had been selected for a special mission. He would impersonate General Montgomery. He would travel to Gibraltar and possibly North Africa. He would be observed by German intelligence officers. The deception might convince Germany that Allied invasion plans focused on the Mediterranean rather than France. The operation could save thousands of Allied lives. James was told he could not refuse. This was military orders. Refusal would result in court-martial. He would participate regardless of his preferences, but cooperation would be rewarded. After the war, he would be allowed to write about his experience. He would receive recognition for his service. If he performed well, it might restart his acting career, which had stalled before the war. James agreed to cooperate. He had no real choice. The orders were clear. But he was also intrigued. This was the most significant role he had ever been offered, playing Montgomery in front of an audience of German spies. Success meant professional vindication. Failure meant possible exposure as a fraud and potential consequences for the invasion. The training began immediately. James was moved to a secure facility outside London. He was given a room with guards posted outside. He was not permitted to leave. All alcohol was removed from the facility. James began withdrawal symptoms within hours. Shaking hands, nausea, headaches, sweating. The medical officer assigned to monitor him provided minimal symptomatic treatment, but no alcohol. James would have to endure withdrawal while learning to impersonate Montgomery. The first instructor was a lieutenant colonel who had served on Montgomery's staff. The officer showed James films of Montgomery speaking, walking, gesturing. Montgomery's mannerisms were distinctive. He held his hands behind his back when walking. He saluted with exaggerated precision. He spoke in clipped, rapid sentences. He made eye contact intensely when addressing subordinates. His posture was rigid, almost mechanical. James practiced for hours. Walk across the room like Montgomery. Turn, salute, speak. The instructor corrected every mistake. Hands higher behind the back. Salute sharper, chin up, eyes forward, shoulders back. Montgomery projected supreme confidence bordering on arrogance. James had to capture that attitude. A tentative Montgomery would be unconvincing. The voice was particularly difficult. Montgomery spoke with distinctive accent and rhythm. Clipped consonants, shortened vowels, rapid delivery. James was Australian. His natural accent was wrong. He practiced Montgomery's speech patterns repeatedly. The instructor recorded James's voice and played it back alongside recordings of Montgomery. The differences were obvious. Slower. Do it again. Sharper. Again. Faster. Again. After 3 days, James could deliver a passable imitation of Montgomery's voice. Not perfect. Close enough to fool someone who had never met Montgomery personally. The goal was not to convince Montgomery's staff. The goal was to convince German intelligence officers observing from a distance. They would see a figure in British General's uniform who moved and spoke like Montgomery. They would not hear extended conversation or interact closely. The prosthetic finger arrived on the 4th day. A technician fitted it carefully. The prosthetic was molded to match James's hand. It was attached to his right hand, covering the stub of his missing finger. The color matched his skin tone approximately. The prosthetic could not move independently, but gave the appearance of a complete finger when James's hand was at rest or in motion. He practiced saluting with the prosthetic. It looked convincing if no one examined closely. The uniform was tailored precisely. Montgomery wore his general's uniform with specific badges and insignia. The beret was distinctive. Montgomery wore it at a particular angle. The coat was cut to Montgomery's specifications. Everything had to be exact. German intelligence officers would compare photographs to the figure they observed. Any discrepancy might suggest deception. James was photographed extensively wearing the uniform. Intelligence officers studied the photographs alongside photos of the real Montgomery. The resemblance was remarkable. From 20 yards, even someone familiar with Montgomery might be fooled. From 200 yards through binoculars, the deception was virtually undetectable. But maintaining the deception required more than appearance. James had to stay sober. The first week was brutal. He experienced severe withdrawal symptoms. He begged for alcohol. The guards refused. Medical officers monitored him constantly. By the end of the first week, the physical symptoms had mostly subsided, but the psychological craving remained intense. James was told repeatedly that the operation's success depended on his sobriety. If he appeared drunk, German observers would know something was wrong. If he failed, the invasion might be compromised. Thousands of Allied soldiers might die because he could not stay sober for a few days. The weight of responsibility was meant to motivate him. Mostly, it terrified him. By May 26th, after 10 days of training, the handlers judged James ready, not perfect, but adequate. He could walk, salute, and speak like Montgomery convincingly enough to fool distant observers. He understood that he should minimize conversation. Let handlers do the talking. Maintain Montgomery's aloof demeanor. Stay visible, but not interactive. The plan was finalized. James would fly to Gibraltar on May 26th. He would be met by the governor and senior military officers. German intelligence operated openly in Spain. Gibraltar was visible from Spanish territory. German observers watched the airfield constantly through binoculars and telescopes. Any high-ranking British officer arriving in Gibraltar was reported to Berlin within hours. James would spend several hours in Gibraltar. He would be driven through streets in an open car. He would attend meetings at Government House. He would be photographed. German agents in Gibraltar, and there were many, would observe and report. The presence of Montgomery in Gibraltar would suggest that Allied invasion planning focused on the Mediterranean. From Gibraltar, James would fly to North Africa, possibly Algiers or Cairo. He would be seen at military headquarters. More German agents would observe and report. Then he would return to Britain quietly. The entire operation would last perhaps 4 to 5 days. James had to maintain the deception for less than a week. Then he could disappear back into obscurity. On the morning of May 26th, James was driven to an RAF airfield. He wore Montgomery's uniform, the beret at the correct angle, the prosthetic finger in place. Handlers accompanied him, officers assigned to manage the operation and keep James sober and on script. They boarded an aircraft. James sat where he would be visible through the windows. The handlers briefed him again. Minimal conversation. Let us do the talking. Just look like Montgomery. The flight took approximately 4 hours. James was not given alcohol. He was given tea and biscuits. He tried to sleep but could not. The psychological pressure was overwhelming. He was about to perform the most important role of his life. Success meant professional redemption. Failure meant humiliation and potentially strategic disaster. The aircraft landed at Gibraltar at approximately 14:30 hours. As the door opened, James saw British officers waiting on the tarmac. Behind them, across the border in Spain, he knew German observers were watching through binoculars. He took a breath, adjusted his beret, and stepped out of the aircraft. He saluted exactly as Montgomery would, sharp, precise, chin up. He walked across the tarmac with Montgomery's distinctive gait, hands behind back, shoulders rigid. The governor of Gibraltar greeted him. James shook hands, using his left hand to avoid scrutiny of the prosthetic finger on his right hand. He spoke briefly, just a few words in Montgomery's clipped accent. Then, he was escorted to a waiting car. The car was open-topped, designed to ensure visibility. James sat in the back seat. The car drove slowly through Gibraltar's streets. British soldiers saluted. James returned the salutes with Montgomery's precision. Civilians watched and waved. James maintained Montgomery's aloof expression, confident, slightly disdainful, entirely self-assured. At Government House, James attended a brief meeting. The handlers had scripted the conversation carefully. The governor asked about invasion planning. James gave vague responses using Montgomery's speech patterns. Everything is proceeding on schedule. The men are in excellent spirits. Victory is certain. The responses were generic, but delivered with Montgomery's characteristic confidence. James was then photographed. The official photographs were released to press agencies. British newspapers would publish them in coming days. German intelligence would see them. The photographs showed Montgomery in Gibraltar, which suggested Mediterranean invasion planning. After 2 hours at Government House, James was driven back to the airfield. He boarded the aircraft for the flight to Algiers. So far, the operation had proceeded without incident. James had maintained the character convincingly. German observers had reported Montgomery's presence. Berlin had been informed. But the psychological strain was immense. James desperately wanted alcohol. His hands shook when he thought no one was watching. He sweated constantly. The handlers noticed but did nothing. They could not risk giving him alcohol. The operation had to continue. James would have to endure. The flight to Algiers took approximately 3 hours. James arrived after dark. He was driven directly to Allied headquarters. The handlers had arranged for him to be seen briefly by senior officers who were briefed about the deception. James attended a dinner where he was introduced to several generals and admirals. He spoke minimally. He maintained Montgomery's manner confident to the point of arrogance, dismissive of small talk, focused on military matters. After dinner, James was escorted to secure quarters. He collapsed. The strain of maintaining the character for 12 hours had exhausted him. He begged the handlers for alcohol. They refused. He became angry, then desperate, then resigned. The handlers told him the operation would last 2 more days. Then he could drink himself unconscious if he wanted. But for now, he had to stay sober. The next day, James was driven through Algiers. He attended a meeting at AFHQ Allied Forces headquarters. He was photographed again. German intelligence in North Africa was extensive. Agents would report Montgomery's presence. The reports would reach Berlin within 24 hours. German analysts would conclude that Allied invasion planning involved the Mediterranean theater. Montgomery's presence in North Africa seemed to confirm this. On May 29th, James flew back to Gibraltar. He spent another day being visible. Then, on May 30th, he was flown back to England on an unmarked transport aircraft. He arrived late at night. He was driven to the secure facility where he had trained. The handlers told him the operation was complete. He had performed well. German intelligence had reported Montgomery's presence in Gibraltar and North Africa exactly as planned. James was told he would remain in secure custody for another week. He could not be released immediately because news of the real Montgomery's activities might contradict the deception. If James appeared in London while Montgomery was in England, someone might notice 2 Montgomerys existed. Better to keep James isolated until after D-Day. James demanded alcohol. The handlers refused. The deception had to be maintained through D-Day in case German intelligence was still monitoring. If James was released and got drunk and talked, he might compromise the operation. He would remain sober and confined until the invasion succeeded. James spent the next week in isolated quarters. No alcohol, no visitors. Guards prevented him from leaving. He was told D-Day had occurred on June 6th. The invasion was succeeding. The deception operations, including Operation Copperhead, had worked. German forces had been positioned to defend the Pas-de-Calais and the Mediterranean. Normandy had been more lightly defended than it would have been if Germany had concentrated forces there. On June 13th, James was released. He was given back his lieutenant's uniform. He was debriefed. He was told the operation was still classified and he could not discuss it publicly. He returned to his regular duties with the Pay Corps. He was transferred to a different unit where no one knew about his involvement in Operation Copperhead. James immediately resumed drinking. Within days, he was drunk as often as he had been before the operation. His commanding officers noted the behavior but took no action. James had performed an important service. If he chose to drink himself to death afterward, that was his choice. The army would not intervene as long as he fulfilled his basic duties. James served out the war in administrative positions. After Germany surrendered, he was demobilized. He returned to civilian life in Britain. His acting career had been interrupted by 6 years of military service. He was 48 years old, an alcoholic, with no recent professional credits. Work was scarce. In 1954, James published a memoir titled I Was Monty's Double. The book described his experience impersonating Montgomery. The publication was approved by British authorities. Enough time had passed that the operational details could be revealed without compromising intelligence methods. The book received modest attention. It confirmed what some intelligence historians had suspected, that deception operations supporting D-Day had included physical impersonation of senior commanders. In 1958, the book was adapted into a film also titled I Was Monty's Double. James played himself in the film. He portrayed his own impersonation of Montgomery, which created the odd situation of an actor playing himself, playing someone else. The film was modestly successful. It provided James with brief professional recognition and some financial security. But the recognition came at a cost. James had to relive the experience repeatedly during filming. He had to play himself undergoing alcohol withdrawal, learning to impersonate Montgomery, enduring the psychological strain. The filming was difficult because it reminded him of the worst days of his life, days when he was denied alcohol, days when he was terrified of failure, days when his every gesture was scrutinized and corrected. After the film, James returned to obscurity. He continued drinking. He lived on a modest military pension and residuals from the book and film. He gave occasional interviews to historians and journalists interested in deception operations. He always described Operation Copperhead as the most important thing he ever did. More important than any stage role, more important than any film. He had impersonated one of Britain's most famous generals and helped deceive Hitler. That achievement defined him. James died in 1963 at age 66. His death was attributed to complications from chronic alcoholism. His obituary in the Times mentioned his service in both World Wars and his role in Operation Copperhead. The obituary noted that he had looked so much like Montgomery that German intelligence was completely fooled. What the obituary did not mention was the personal cost of that deception. James had been sober for less than 2 weeks during the operation. Those 2 weeks were among the most difficult of his life. The withdrawal symptoms, the constant supervision, the fear of failure, the psychological pressure, the knowledge that thousands of lives might depend on his ability to stay sober and maintain character. The burden had been crushing. After the operation, James had returned to drinking with intensity that suggested he was self-medicating for trauma. The experience had not cured his alcoholism. If anything, it had worsened it. The brief period of enforced sobriety, followed by release back to normal life without support or treatment, had reinforced his dependence on alcohol. The handlers who had kept James sober during the operation bore some responsibility for his subsequent decline. They had used him for intelligence purposes. They had forced sobriety on him temporarily without addressing the underlying addiction. After the operation, they had abandoned him to his fate. There was no follow-up care, no addiction treatment, no psychological support. James was simply returned to his unit and forgotten. The pattern was common in wartime intelligence operations. Individuals were recruited, used, and discarded. The operational necessity overwhelmed personal welfare. James's alcoholism was inconvenient during the operation, so it was suppressed by force. After the operation, his alcoholism was irrelevant, so it was ignored. The human cost of deception was not calculated in operational assessments. Post-war analysis of Operation Copperhead concluded it was moderately successful. German intelligence reported Montgomery's presence in Gibraltar in North Africa. German analysts noted the reports. Some German units were positioned to defend against potential Mediterranean invasion, but it is unclear whether Operation Copperhead alone significantly affected German defensive planning. The larger deception operations, particularly Operation Fortitude, which created fictitious army groups and fed false intelligence through double agents, probably had greater strategic impact. Copperhead was a small part of a massive deception effort. James's contribution was real but modest in the larger context of D-Day planning. But for James personally, the operation was everything. It was the peak of his professional life. It was the moment when his physical resemblance to Montgomery and his acting ability combined to serve a strategic purpose. It was also the moment when his alcoholism was most clearly exposed and when he was forced to confront it without support or treatment. The tragedy was that James's greatest success was also a profound personal failure. He succeeded in impersonating Montgomery. He fooled German intelligence. He contributed to D-Day's success, but he could not stay sober afterward. The operation that should have been his redemption became instead a temporary interruption in his decline. The handlers who managed James during the operation later reflected on the experience in classified after-action reports. They noted the difficulty of working with an alcoholic agent. They recommended that future operations avoid recruiting individuals with substance abuse problems. They acknowledged that maintaining James's sobriety had been one of the operation's most difficult challenges, more difficult than creating the physical resemblance or training him in Montgomery's mannerisms. But they also noted that James had performed well under extreme pressure. He had maintained character convincingly. He had not broken during the operation. He had done what was asked despite enormous personal difficulty. The handlers gave him credit for professionalism under circumstances that would have broken many people. The prosthetic finger had worked adequately. German observers had not noticed the difference. Photographs showed James with what appeared to be a complete hand. The technical aspect of the deception had succeeded, but the human aspect managing James's alcoholism and psychological state had been barely controlled chaos. David Niven, who had recruited James, later wrote about the experience briefly in his memoirs. Niven noted that finding someone who resembled Montgomery had been extraordinarily difficult. He praised James for his performance, but Niven also acknowledged that using an alcoholic for such an operation had been risky. If James had gotten drunk in Gibraltar, the entire operation would have collapsed. Niven did not discuss what happened to James after the operation. Niven returned to Hollywood after the war and resumed his acting career successfully. James remained in Britain, drinking heavily, living on a modest pension. The two men's post-war trajectories illustrated the gulf between those who managed deception operations and those who were the instruments of deception. Operation Copperhead remained classified until the 1970s, when British intelligence began declassifying World War II deception operations. Historians gained access to operational files. They learned about James's recruitment, training, and performance. They learned about the handler's struggles to keep him sober. They learned about the operation's modest success and James's subsequent decline. The story of M.E. Clifton James in Operation Copperhead became a footnote in D-Day history, a minor deception operation among dozens, a small contribution among massive strategic efforts. But for James, it was everything. The 2 weeks he spent impersonating Montgomery defined his life: the enforced sobriety, the training, the performance, the success, and then the return to alcoholism and obscurity. He had been asked to sacrifice his health for military deception. He had complied. He had succeeded. And then he had been forgotten. This was the personal cost of deception in World War II. Individuals used for intelligence purposes and then discarded. Their contributions noted in classified files. Their subsequent suffering ignored. James was one of many. His story was unusual because his role was public. Most remained anonymous. The deception operations that supported D-Day saved thousands of Allied lives by convincing Germany to position forces away from Normandy. Those lives saved came at a cost measured not just in resources and planning, but in human sacrifice. Some sacrifices were dramatic: double agents executed when discovered, resistance fighters killed during deception operations. Other sacrifices were quiet alcoholics forced into sobriety temporarily and then abandoned to their addiction. Clifton James was one of the quiet sacrifices. He impersonated Montgomery convincingly enough to fool German intelligence. He stayed sober long enough to complete the operation. Then he returned to drinking and died of alcoholism at 66. His contribution to D-Day was real but small. His personal cost was large. The disproportion between sacrifice and recognition defined his experience and defines the human cost of deception operations that history books summarize in a few paragraphs.